April 9, 1942. The sun over the Bataan Peninsula had not even cleared the tree line, and already the heat pressed down like a hand. Private Lester Cheney stood in a column of nearly 76,000 men. Most were Filipino. Thousands were American. Hours earlier, their commander had surrendered the largest force in American military history to fall to an enemy. None of them yet understood what that surrender would cost. They thought they were prisoners now, safe in the strange logic of war. Fed, guarded, eventually traded home. What they did not know was that the walk in front of them would kill more men than most of the battles that came before it. 65 miles. No water most of the way. Temperatures past 110 degrees. And it would become known to history, simply, as the Bataan Death March. Here is what the numbers still can't explain on their own. Historians Michael and Elizabeth Norman, who spent years interviewing survivors for their book Tears in the Darkness, found something that surprised even them. The march itself did not kill the most men. What killed the most men came after it, in a camp most people have never heard of. But we'll get to that. First, we have to understand what these men actually were before they became prisoners. They were the defenders of Bataan. For full months, cut off from resupply, they had held a peninsula the size of a small American county against a Japanese army that expected an easy victory. They ate their pack mules, then their carabao, then almost nothing at all. By the time General Edward King raised the white flag, his men weighed, on average, 30 pounds less than when the siege began. He surrendered not because his soldiers had stopped fighting, he surrendered because there was nothing left to fight with. So when the march began, it did not begin with strong men. It began with men already starved, already sick with malaria and dysentery, already 3 months past exhaustion. Many hadn't eaten a full meal in weeks. Some could barely lift a rifle, let alone carry one for 65 miles. And then they were told to walk. Think about that for a moment. An army that had just spent 4 months proving it would not break was handed to its captors already broken by hunger alone. The fighting hadn't beaten them. Starvation had. What happens to a man's judgment, his patience, his ability to keep walking, after months of eating almost nothing at all? Picture it plainly. A dirt road running north from the town of Mariveles. Dust rising in a haze that never seemed to settle. Men shoulder to shoulder, some barefoot, boots long since rotted off in the jungle mud. The column stretched for miles, guarded on both sides by soldiers who were, by most accounts, just as unprepared for what they were doing as the prisoners were. Because here is the detail most people miss. The Japanese command under General Homma had expected to process perhaps 25,000 captives. Instead, they found themselves responsible for more than 70,000, most of them already dying on their feet. There was no plan for this, no food stockpiled, no transport arranged, no water discipline established. What followed was not, historians largely agree, a single order to destroy the prisoners. It was something almost worse. A total catastrophic failure to prepare, carried out by individual guards with total power over men who had nothing left. What does absolute power do to an ordinary soldier who has also been fighting for months without rest? That question sits underneath almost every eyewitness account that survives. Lester Cheney later wrote that the worst part was not any single moment of cruelty, it was the accumulation. A man collapses from heat exhaustion. He is told to get up. He cannot. The column keeps moving because stopping is not permitted. Cheney did not describe what came next in graphic terms, and neither should we, or not they ever spoke of it. Thirst did more damage than almost anything else. The men marched past artesian wells, past streams, sometimes within arm's reach of water they were forbidden to drink. Some broke ranks anyway, desperate enough to risk everything for a swallow. Others held on, counting the miles, telling themselves it could not be much farther. It was always farther. At night they were packed into open fields, too crowded to lie down fully, too exhausted to care. No shelter, No medical care for men who by then were suffering from wounds, dysentery, and malaria all at once. And still, every morning, the column moved again. There were moments of unexpected mercy too, and the record is honest about those as well. Some individual guards shared what little rice they had. Filipino civilians along the route risked their own safety to toss bundles of food and sugarcane toward the column as it passed, even when doing so could bring a rifle butt down on them for the attempt. Survivors remembered those small acts for the rest of their lives, sometimes more vividly than the cruelty. It's a detail that resists the simple version of this story, the one where every guard is the same, and every civilian is powerless. The truth on that road was messier, and more human, than that. 6 days, for some men closer to 9, 65 miles on foot, and then, for those who survived the walking, a final leg by rail. Boxcars built to hold 40 men were packed with over 100, doors sealed shut in tropical heat, for a 4-hour ride to the town of Capas. From there, one last 5-mile walk to a place called Camp O'Donnell. And this is where the story bends into something few people expect. The march is what gave this event its name, but the march was not what killed the most men. At Camp O'Donnell, conditions did not improve. There was one working water spigot for thousands of prisoners. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Dysentery spread unchecked through men whose bodies had no strength left to fight it. In the first 6 weeks alone, historians estimate that more American and Filipino prisoners died inside that camp than died during the entire march that brought them there. The walking had been the visible horror. The camp was the quiet one. And it was worse. Why does almost nobody know that part? Maybe because a march has a beginning and an end, a shape you can put in a title. A camp just goes on, day after identical day, and there's no single moment to point to. But the men who survived both knew exactly which one had taken more of their friends. Some of them tried to tell the world as soon as they could. In 1944, 3 American officers who had escaped from a later Japanese prison camp made their way back to Allied lines and gave sworn statements describing what had happened on Bataan and afterward. Their report became one of the first detailed accounts to reach Washington, and it helped shape how the American public understood the war in the Pacific for the rest of the conflict. Even then, officials debated how much of it to release, worried about the effect the details might have on families waiting at home for word of missing sons. Lester Tenney survived Camp O'Donnell. He survived years afterward as a forced laborer in a Japanese coal mine, an experience he later wrote about so that people would not be allowed to forget either chapter. He lived until 2017, one of the last voices who could describe Bataan not as a statistic, but as a place he had actually walked. General Homma, the man who commanded the forces responsible, was tried after the war and executed in 1946. Found accountable not for a single order, historians largely conclude, but for failing to control what happened under his command. So, what do we do with a story like this, decades later, from the safety of wherever you're watching this right now? Every year in the desert of White Sands, New Mexico, thousands of people gather before dawn for something called the Bataan Memorial Death March. They are not prisoners. Nobody is forcing them to walk. Veterans, active duty soldiers, students, and civilians lace up their boots and cover up to 26 miles across sand that gets almost as brutal as the Philippine heat once was. Some carry packs weighted down on purpose, a small, voluntary echo of what real men once carried without a choice. They do it so the walk is not forgotten, so the camp at the end of it is not forgotten either. That's the strange power of memory. Nobody chose to survive Bataan, but every year, people choose to remember it, one deliberate mile at a time. The sun over the Bataan Peninsula still rises past 100 degrees most mornings in April. It no longer falls on starving men in a forced column. It falls on a quiet memorial, and on descendants who were never there, and on the rest of us, learning one story at a time, what 70,000 men once endured just to survive the first week of being called prisoners of war.